How long have you been with us, Melody? 29 years, is it? David Langston, the director at GRW Manufacturing, leaned back in his luxurious leather chair, his voice deceptively casual, as if discussing the weather rather than my life's work. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of his corner office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. 29 years and 362 days, to be precise, I replied, my voice steady despite the knot tightening in my stomach. I couldn't help but notice the manila folder resting ominously on his desk, its edges crisp and untouched. In all my years at GRW Manufacturing, one of St. Paul's largest industrial firms, I had never been summoned to a director's office on a Friday afternoon. The timing felt deliberate, and a quiet dread began to settle over me. Something was terribly wrong. My name is Melody Reynolds, and at 61 years old, I had served as the senior compliance officer at GRW for nearly 3 decades. Until 5 minutes ago, I had been a pillar of the company, ensuring that every operation adhered to stringent legal and ethical standards. My role required meticulous attention to detail, documenting irregularities, and standing firm when others pushed for shortcuts to solve complex problems. My pension, the culmination of a lifetime of dedication, was set to fully vest on Monday, just 3 days away. That milestone, the financial security I had worked tirelessly to achieve, was finally within my grasp. David slid the manila folder across his desk with a calculated flick of his wrist. Due to budget constraints, we're letting you go, he said, his eyes avoiding mine regions. System. Mine entirely. Effective immediately. The room seemed to tilt, the air growing heavy as his words sank in. Budget constraints? GRW had just reported record-breaking profits last quarter, a fact celebrated in the company newsletter with bold headlines. This wasn't about budgets, it was something else entirely. This is your severance package, David continued, tapping the folder with a manicured finger. Sign by tomorrow, or you get nothing. HR will escort you to clear out your desk. His tone was clipped, final, as if he'd rehearsed this moment. I should have been consumed by anger or desperation, but instead, a strange calm enveloped me. This wasn't a random decision. The timing 3 days before my pension vested was too precise, too calculated. Thank you for the opportunity, I said quietly, picking/struct. System. Picking up the folder without opening it. David's eyebrows lifted slightly, perhaps expecting tears or protests, but I'd spent my career analyzing patterns, and this one was glaringly obvious. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and walked out with my dignity intact. Janet from HR hovered awkwardly as I packed my belongings. A faded photograph of my late husband, Thomas, a small potted plant my daughter, Elizabeth, had given me when she left for college 15 years ago, and a polished plaque commemorating my 25 years of service. I didn't take much. The things that truly mattered couldn't be contained in a cardboard box. I'm so sorry, Melody, Janet whispered, glancing nervously at the security guard waiting to escort me out. This isn't right. It is what it is, I replied, but inside I knew better. This wasn't just unfair, it was potentially illegal. For the past 4 years, I had meticulously documented financial irregularities at GRW, patterns that had intensified since David's arrival 6 months ago. Suspicious loan applications, manipulated quarterly reports, backdated quality control certifications. I'd flagged them all, sending detailed memos up the chain, only to have them dismissed or buried with instructions to focus on more pressing matters. As I walked through the lobby for the final time, the security guard held the door, his discomfort evident. Have a good weekend, Mrs. Reynolds, he said, his voice tinged with unease. I nodded politely. I believe I will. The drive home felt surreal, the weight of 29 years of loyalty reduced to a manila folder and a cardboard box. April rain pattered against my windshield as I navigated the familiar streets of St. Paul, Minnesota, past the cathedral where Thomas and I had exchanged vows, past the school where Elizabeth had graduated, toward the modest home I'd maintained alone since becoming a widow 12 years ago. My mind replayed the sacrifices I'd made for GRW, missed recitals in my early years, family vacations cut short by compliance emergencies, countless evenings poring over documents no one else had the patience to scrutinize. I'd given the company my prime years, trusting in the promise of a secure retirement. At home, I brewed a pot of tea and sat at my kitchen table, finally opening the severance package. The terms were insulting: 3 months' salary in exchange for waiving all future claims against GRW. No pension, no healthcare continuation, no acknowledgement of nearly 3 decades of service, just a check and a legal trap designed to silence me. The document demanded my signature by 5 p.m. tomorrow, banking on fear and desperation to ensure my compliance. But I wasn't desperate. I was prepared. I set the papers aside and walked to my home office, where I kept a fireproof lockbox behind a row of family photo albums. My insurance policy. For 4 years, I'd been quietly collecting copies of troubling financial documents, noting conversations, and saving emails that outlined misconduct. Not because I planned to use them, but because my instincts, honed over decades, warned me something was amiss. Opening the box, I reviewed its contents: loan applications with falsified data, quarterly reports with manipulated figures, emails instructing staff to backdate certifications. Over 1,000 pages of evidence, meticulously organized, chronicling systematic fraud that had escalated under David's leadership. I'd reported every issue through proper channels, only to be ignored or sidelined. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in years: Gregory Santos, GRW's former CFO, now with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He'd always respected my diligence, even when others found it tedious. My finger hovered over his name. It was time. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. After a nearly 2-hour conversation with Gregory the previous evening, my path was clear. I dressed in the Navy suit I reserved for significant occasions, as if preparing for battle. Because, in a way, I was. Gregory had listened intently as I outlined the situation and described my documentation. "This isn't just wrongful termination, Melody," he'd said, his voice measured but resolute. "Based on what you're describing, GRW could be facing serious securities violations. The timing with your pension? That's just the tip of the iceberg." He explained the whistleblower protections available through the SEC and arranged for me to meet his team on Monday morning. "Don't sign anything," he cautioned, "and secure those documents somewhere safe." Saturday morning, I made copies of everything, organizing the evidence chronologically with a detailed index. The work kept my mind focused, staving off the anger and hurt threatening to surface. By noon, I had 3 identical packages. One for the SEC, one for my records, and one as leverage if needed. My phone buzzed repeatedly: Janet, David, even the company's general counsel. I let their increasingly urgent voicemails pile up. "Melody, we need that paperwork signed today," David's tense voice insisted. "I can come by and pick it up if that helps." The general counsel was blunter. "Ms. Reynolds, it's imperative we receive your signed agreement before close of business. Failure to comply could jeopardize your severance entirely." Their desperation confirmed my suspicions. They knew they were vulnerable and wanted my silence secured before the weekend ended. At 4:30 p.m., my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw David on my porch, his expensive suit jarring against my modest neighborhood. "Melody, I know you're in there," he called. "This is ridiculous. Just sign the papers, and we can all move on." I watched silently as he left another copy of the agreement in my mailbox with a handwritten note: "Final opportunity. Sign by 9 a.m. Monday." That evening, my daughter, Elizabeth, called for our weekly chat. She sensed something off in my voice. "Mom, what's going on? You sound different." I considered brushing it off but opted for honesty. "I was terminated yesterday," I said simply.
"What?"
"But you're days away from your full pension. They can't do that." "They did," I replied. "But don't worry, I'm handling it. Do you need me to come home? I can be on a flight from Denver tomorrow." "No, sweetheart, stay put. I've got this covered." After we hung up, I sat in my living room as darkness fell, thinking about Monday's meeting with the SEC. For years, I tried to address these issues internally, believing in the company's integrity. I'd been loyal, discreet, professional, even as I suspected serious wrongdoing. But GRW had made its choice, and now I would make mine. I wouldn't sign their agreement. I wouldn't be silenced. Most importantly, I wouldn't let them erase 3 decades of my life without consequence. Monday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I dressed carefully, secured my documentation in a briefcase, and drove downtown to the federal building. The weight of my actions pressed on me, but there was also a sense of rightness. The SEC offices were understated yet imposing, all glass partitions and hushed conversations. Gregory met me in the lobby, his face lined with age, but still sharp with the intelligence I remembered. "Melody," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "Good to see you, Gregory. Thank you for taking this seriously." He led me to a conference room where 2 investigators waited, Angela Brennan, a senior enforcement attorney, and James Weston, a forensic accountant. Both greeted me with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Reynolds," Angela began, "before we start, I want to confirm you understand the process. Once you share this information, an investigation becomes official. There's no turning back." I nodded. "I understand completely." For the next 3 hours, I walked them through the evidence, detailing the patterns of misconduct, the falsified data, and the dismissed reports. My documentation spoke for itself, a testament to years of vigilance. The truth was clear, and I was ready to see it through. The conference room at the Securities and Exchange Commission's regional office in Minneapolis was starkly lit, its glass walls reflecting the quiet intensity of the moment. Melody Reynolds, sat across from Angela Brennan, James Weston, and Gregory Santos, laying out the evidence I'd compiled over 4 years. The documents detailed irregular financial reporting that I'd first noticed when shipment records failed to align with invoices, quality control certifications backdated after products had already left the warehouse, and a troubling pattern of revenue manipulation that had grown more aggressive in recent quarters, particularly since David Langston's arrival at GRW Manufacturing 6 months ago. James, the forensic accountant, scrutinized the financial records with a deepening frown, his brow furrowed as he pored over the numbers. "These discrepancies aren't minor oversights," he said, his voice edged with concern. "The company has been systematically overstating its revenues by at least 19% for the past 2 years. That's not an error, it's deliberate securities fraud." Angela, the senior enforcement attorney, leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on me. "And you reported these issues internally?" she asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. "Multiple times," I confirmed, sliding copies of my memos and emails across the table. "I raised concerns through proper channels, 47 major reports over 4 years, 16 memos specifically addressing these financial irregularities, and 9 requests for meetings with executive leadership. Only 2 meetings were granted, and neither resulted in action. When David joined the company, my reports were rerouted to his office, where they vanished entirely." Gregory, my former colleague now with the SEC, leaned forward, his expression grave. "You believe your termination was directly tied to these reports?" "Without question," I replied. "The timing, 3 days before my pension vested, makes it glaringly obvious. But more than that, I had recently flagged several critical issues with David's latest cost-cutting initiative, a plan that skirted multiple regulatory requirements. He needed me gone before I could escalate further." As the meeting drew to a close, Angela outlined the next steps with practiced precision. "We'll need your formal statement to initiate the investigation. These typically remain confidential until we determine whether enforcement action is warranted." "How long will that take?" I asked, my voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "It varies," she replied, "but given the volume and clarity of your documentation, we may move quickly on this one." I hadn't even made it home before my phone rang. It was Janet from HR, her voice trembling with urgency. "Melody, something's happening. The board just called an emergency meeting. David's been locked in his office all morning, and there are rumors about SEC investigators contacting our general counsel." So it had begun. Faster than I'd anticipated. The SEC must have moved swiftly, reaching out to GRW's legal team within hours of our meeting. "I'm not surprised," I said calmly. Janet hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Melody, did you report something?" "I simply did what I should have done years ago," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What's happening with my pension paperwork?" "That's why I'm calling," she said. "The executive committee is reviewing your termination. They've put everything on hold until further notice." An hour later, another call came, this time from William Hargrove, the chairman of the board, a man who had barely acknowledged my existence in our rare prior encounters. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, his usually commanding voice strained, "we seem to have a situation that requires your input. Would you be willing to come to the office tomorrow morning to discuss matters?" "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Hargrove," I replied, my tone polite but firm. "Any discussions should include my attorney and, potentially, representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'm sure you understand." The silence on the other end was palpable. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I see. Perhaps we can arrange something more formal then." As I hung up, I felt no triumph, only a deep weariness at the necessity of it all. I had never aspired to be a whistleblower. For 29 years, I had simply wanted to perform my job with integrity, ensuring GRW Manufacturing operated within legal and ethical boundaries, and retire with a pension I'd earned. But the company had forced my hand, and now we would all face the consequences. My phone buzzed incessantly that evening, colleagues fishing for information, executives attempting damage control. I answered none of them. The time for private conversations had passed. Now, everything would unfold in the open. By Wednesday morning, the storm had erupted. Local business publications blared headlines about an SEC investigation into GRW Manufacturing, sending the company's stock into a tailspin, plummeting nearly 30% in pre-market trading. Financial analysts who had lauded David's efficiency measures just weeks ago now questioned the integrity of GRW's entire financial reporting structure. I received a formal letter from GRW's legal department, withdrawing my termination notice and placing me on administrative leave with full benefits pending an internal review. It was a transparent attempt to mitigate damages, but it came far too late to undo the harm. At 10 a.m., my attorney, Barbara Reynolds, no relation, though the coincidence amused us both, accompanied me to a meeting at GRW's headquarters. The same security guard who had escorted me out on Friday now nodded respectfully as we entered. The atmosphere inside was electric with tension, employees huddled in whispered conversations that fell silent as we passed. We were ushered into the main boardroom, where William Hargrove sat with the company's outside counsel and 3 other board members. David Langston was conspicuously absent. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Reynolds," William began, his face haggard, as if he'd aged a decade in days. "We've initiated a comprehensive internal investigation into the concerns you've raised." Before I could respond, Barbara interjected, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Let's be clear, Mr. Hargrove. Ms. Reynolds didn't suddenly raise these concerns after her termination. She documented and reported them consistently over 4 years, as her role required. The company's decision to ignore those reports and then terminate her days before her pension vested speaks volumes about its priorities." William shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming on the table. "Yes, well, that's part of what we're investigating. I want to personally assure Ms. Reynolds that her termination has been rescinded. We consider her an employee in good standing, with all benefits intact." "Including my pension?" I asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Of course," he replied quickly, almost too quickly. "In fact, we're prepared to offer you a consulting role after your retirement, which you can begin immediately if you wish. We value your expertise." "My client isn't making any decisions today," Barbara cut in, "and any discussion of future arrangements must be preceded by a full accounting of how her previous concerns were suppressed." The meeting stretched on for another hour, with the board members attempting to distance themselves from David's actions and the financial irregularities I'd documented. They portrayed themselves as unwitting victims of misinformation, expressing shock and dismay at the apparent misconduct. I remained mostly silent, letting Barbara handle the legal sparring while I observed their body language. These were people I'd worked alongside for decades, yet they'd never truly seen me. Not until now. Their expressions, a mix of fear and reluctant respect, told me they finally understood the gravity of their oversight. As we prepared to leave, William made a final plea. "Melody, we're hoping you might consider speaking with the SEC investigators about the corrective actions we're taking. Your support would be invaluable." I looked at him directly, my voice calm but resolute. "Mr. Hargrove, I've spent 29 years ensuring this company's compliance. During that time, I filed 47 major reports documenting serious irregularities, sent 16 memos specifically addressing the issues now under investigation, and requested 9 meetings with executive leadership to discuss these concerns. Only 2 were granted, and neither resulted in action. At what point in that history did I have your support?" The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. "I'll cooperate fully with both the internal investigation and the SEC," I continued, "but I'll speak only to the facts, as I always have. Whether those facts support or damage GRW will depend entirely on what you do next, not what you say in this room." As Barbara and I walked out, she whispered, "That was perfectly stated." It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that I allowed myself a deep breath. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to ebb, leaving me exhausted but clear-headed. This wasn't victory, not yet. It was merely the beginning of accountability. "What happens now?" I asked Barbara as we stood beside our cars. She smiled faintly. "Now they scramble to save what they can while the investigation continues. But make no mistake, Melody, they're terrified of you." I shook my head. "They're not terrified of me. They're terrified of the truth. There's a difference." Barbara nodded thoughtfully. "There is indeed. And that difference is why you'll win this, regardless of how it plays out." Driving home, I thought of my late husband, Thomas, who had always championed my meticulous nature, even when others found it tedious. "Your attention to detail isn't a quirk, Melody," he'd say with a grin. "It's a superpower." Perhaps he'd been right all along. By Friday, exactly 1 week after my termination, the story had escalated into a full-blown corporate scandal. The SEC had issued formal requests for information from GRW, and an internal memo from William Hargrove announced David Langston's immediate suspension, pending investigation. The company's stock had dropped nearly 30%, triggering alarm among major investors and partners. I was no longer just Melody Reynolds, the overlooked compliance officer. Business journals now referred to me as the whistleblower who exposed GRW manufacturing. The sudden attention was disconcerting, but I stayed focused on the process, working closely with the SEC investigators, who had set up temporary offices near GRW's headquarters. My evidence had opened many doors, but the investigation was uncovering even deeper issues: offshore accounts, unreported liabilities, and a web of transactions designed to obscure the company's true financial state. As I sat at my kitchen table that evening, sipping tea and reviewing correspondence from my attorney, my daughter, Elizabeth, called. "Mom, I saw the news," she said, her voice a mix of pride and concern. "You're incredible. But are you okay?" "I'm okay," I assured her. "It's not over yet, but I'm doing what I need to do." "I wish Dad could see this," she said softly. "He'd be so proud." I smiled, my eyes misting. "I think he does, sweetheart." After we hung up, I walked to my home office and opened the fireproof lockbox once more, not to review its contents, but to reflect on the journey that had brought me here. For 29 years, I had been the unseen guardian of GRW's integrity, working diligently in the shadows. Now, those shadows had parted, and the truth I'd protected was finally coming to light. The road ahead would be challenging: legal battles, public scrutiny, the weight of a company's fate partially in my hands. But I was ready. I had spent my career preparing for this moment, not by choice but by necessity. GRW Manufacturing had underestimated me, but they would not do so again. And as for my pension, my dignity, my legacy, they were no longer theirs to take. They were mine, earned through decades of unwavering commitment, and I would defend them to the end. Gregory Santos's voice crackled through the phone, heavy with the weight of new discoveries. "Melody, it's worse than we thought," he said, his tone grave. "The financial manipulation at GRW Manufacturing goes back at least 5 years, predating David Langston. He accelerated it, but he didn't start it." I sat at my kitchen table, the familiar comfort of my St. Paul home suddenly feeling distant. "I suspected as much," I replied, my voice steady despite the sinking feeling in my chest. There were irregularities I couldn't fully document because I lacked access to certain executive-level reports. "Well, we can access them now," Gregory continued. "And they paint a damning picture of systematic fraud designed to inflate the company's value. The board is claiming ignorance, but at least 3 members had to have known. They signed off on key transactions." This revelation should have felt vindicating, but instead, it left me hollow. The company I'd dedicated nearly 3 decades to, GRW Manufacturing, had been corrupted at levels I hadn't fully grasped. The colleagues I'd trusted with my concerns, the executives I'd reported to, had been complicit in the very fraud I'd been trying to expose. My life's work, ensuring compliance and integrity, had been undermined by those at the top. That afternoon, my daughter, Elizabeth, called, her voice taut with anger. "Mom, have you seen the news? They're trying to discredit you." I'd been avoiding media coverage, focusing instead on the SEC investigation and my attorney's guidance. "What are they saying?" I asked calmly. "David Langston gave an interview," she said, her words clipped. "He's claiming you had performance issues and were bitter about being passed over for a promotion. He's making it sound like you're retaliating out of personal grudges." I wasn't surprised. It was a predictable tactic, attack the whistleblower's credibility rather than address the evidence. "It doesn't matter, Elizabeth," I assured her. "The evidence speaks for itself. My performance reviews have been exemplary for 29 years. They can't rewrite that history." But David was trying to do just that. By evening, several news outlets had picked up his narrative, questioning my motives and suggesting I'd manipulated documentation to frame him. It was a desperate move from a desperate man, but seeing my integrity publicly challenged still stung, like a betrayal layer to top the one I'd already endured. My attorney, Barbara Reynolds, no relation, though the coincidence always brought a faint smile, called immediately. "Don't respond to any of it," she advised firmly. "The SEC will issue a statement tomorrow clarifying your whistleblower status and the credibility of your evidence. Let the official channels handle this." I wasn't planning to respond, I told her, but I am going to do something else. The next morning, I drove to my local bank and requested a meeting with the manager, Tracy Ferguson, a familiar face who had handled many of GRW's local transactions over the years. "Melody," she greeted warmly, her eyes filled with concern. "I've been following the news. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Tracy," I said, managing a small smile. "But I need access to my safe deposit box." In the privacy of the bank's secure room, I opened the box and retrieved a sealed envelope I'd placed there 3 years ago. Inside were copies of email exchanges between David's predecessor and 2 board members, discussing strategies to manage financial appearances during a critical acquisition period. I'd stumbled upon these while archiving old emails and, guided by instinct, had secured them separately from my other documentation. They weren't directly tied to the current issues, so I hadn't included them in my initial SEC report. But now, with David attempting to undermine my credibility, they provided critical context, proving that the fraudulent practices predated my concerns about him specifically. I called Gregory immediately. "I have something you need to see," I told him. "It changes the narrative completely." As I drove to meet him, I felt no satisfaction, only a resolute certainty that the full truth would now emerge, no matter who it implicated. An emergency board meeting was convened Monday morning, 10 days after my termination and 7 days after the SEC investigation went public. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be there to know the impact of my actions. The additional documentation I'd provided had accelerated the investigation dramatically, implicating not just David Langston but multiple board members in a years-long pattern of financial manipulation. Gregory called me from outside the meeting room, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It's chaos in there, Melody. The SEC enforcement team just presented their preliminary findings. 3 board members resigned on the spot. David's trying to claim he was following established practices, but no one's buying it anymore." By noon, GRW issued a press release announcing a leadership restructuring and pledging full cooperation with regulatory authorities. The carefully worded statement confirmed the resignation of 4 board members, including Chairman William Hargrove, and the termination of David Langston for cause. The company's stock, already battered, plummeted another 12%, deepening the crisis. That afternoon, my phone rang again. It was Janet from HR, her voice a mix of relief and nervousness. "The interim CEO wants to meet with you tomorrow, if possible." The interim CEO was Patricia Donovan, the former chief operating officer, a woman who had always treated me with professional respect, if not warmth. I agreed to the meeting, but insisted it take place at my attorney's office. When Patricia arrived the next day, she looked exhausted, her usual composure frayed by the weight of the scandal. "Melody," she began, her voice direct, "I won't waste time with pleasantries. The company is in crisis, and you're at the center of it, not because you did anything wrong, but because you were the only one who consistently did what was right." She slid a folder across the table, its crisp edges eerily reminiscent of the termination paperwork David had presented 11 days earlier. "This officially rescinds your termination, reinstates your employment retroactively, and confirms your full pension vesting," she explained. "It also includes an additional compensation package acknowledging the difficulties you've experienced." I opened the folder. The package offered a sum equivalent to 5 years of my salary, lifetime healthcare coverage, and a formal apology from the board. "We're also establishing a new corporate ethics division," Patricia continued. "We'd like you to help design it as a consultant after your retirement. Your experience is invaluable." I closed the folder without commenting on the offer. "And David Langston?" "The board members involved." Patricia's expression hardened. "Criminal charges are expected. The company will not be defending them." Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived at GRW Manufacturing. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom in Minneapolis, watching as David Langston and 2 former board members entered guilty pleas to securities fraud charges. The man who had so casually ended my career now looked diminished in his dark suit, his arrogance replaced by defeat. Our eyes met briefly as he turned to leave, and I saw a flicker of recognition, not of me as a person, but of what I represented, the consequences of his actions personified. The GRW scandal had become a case study in corporate governance failures and the critical role of internal compliance officers. I had declined the consulting position with the reorganized company, choosing instead to work with regulatory agencies to develop stronger whistleblower protocols. My story had inspired other compliance officers to come forward with their own evidence of corporate wrongdoing, creating a ripple effect across industries. The SEC awarded me a substantial whistleblower payment, 15% of the penalties assessed against GRW. Combined with my pension and the settlement, I had more financial security than I'd ever imagined. I established a scholarship fund for women pursuing careers in corporate ethics and compliance, naming it after my late husband, Thomas, whose belief in my superpower of attention to detail had sustained me through the years. Elizabeth had relocated to St. Paul to be closer to me, bringing my 2 grandchildren with her. We spent weekends together at my new lakeside home, building memories I'd missed during the long hours of my career. One evening, as we watched the sunset over the water, Elizabeth asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you regret staying at GRW all those years, given how it ended?" I considered this carefully, the lake's gentle ripples reflecting the fading light. "No," I finally answered. "I regret that it was necessary to expose them, but I don't regret my work there. Integrity isn't just about being honest when it's easy. It's about upholding your principles even when, especially when it costs you something." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes thoughtful. You taught me that, not with words, but by example. That, I realized, was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of all. Not the vindication, not the financial security, but the knowledge that my choices had shown my daughter what it meant to stand firm in your values, no matter the consequences. As for GRW Manufacturing, the company survived, though greatly diminished. The new leadership implemented stringent compliance protocols and transparent reporting practices. They still sent me their annual reports, perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as an apology. I read them carefully, noting the improvements with professional satisfaction. Some might view my story as one of revenge, but I've never seen it that way. I simply did what I had always done, documented the facts, reported the truth, and stood by my findings. The difference was that this time, finally, others were forced to listen. And in that listening, a reckoning was born, not just for GRW, but for an industry that had too long ignored the quiet voices of those who dared to speak the truth. Please feel free to comment below if you liked this. Remember to like and subscribe for more.